There is a particular kind of silence that ends an argument before it has even properly begun, and almost nobody is ever taught how to use it. It isn't the silence of having nothing to say. It isn't the silence of being too afraid to speak. It's something else entirely, a deliberate, unhurried stillness that says more than any sentence could, and says it in a way that cannot be argued with, interrupted, or talked over, because there is nothing there to grab onto. People who master this particular kind of quiet are rarely the loudest people in a room. They are, almost without exception, the ones everyone else is a little more careful around, without being able to say exactly why. You have likely felt the pull toward the opposite of this countless times, without ever naming it clearly, the hot, immediate urge to answer back the instant something lands wrong, the conviction, in that split second, that silence would somehow mean losing, that only a fast, sharp reply could set the record straight before the moment closes. That urge feels in the body almost like an emergency, demanding an immediate response the same way a physical threat might. And yet, looking back on the arguments that urge has actually won for you over a lifetime, the tally is often far thinner than the urgency in the moment ever suggested it would be. Most people spend their lives believing that respect is won through words, the right comeback delivered at the right moment, the airtight argument that finally makes someone understand, the explanation so thorough it leaves no room for doubt. And sometimes this is true. But there is another category of moment entirely, one that words were never actually built to handle, where speaking only weakens a position that silence would have made unshakable. Learning to recognize these moments, and learning exactly what kind of silence belongs in each one, is one of the most quietly powerful skills a person can build, and almost nobody ever builds it deliberately, because almost nobody is ever told it exists. Almost everyone has a memory of someone who carried this particular skill, even if they've never had language for what made that person different. A grandmother who could silence an entire room with nothing more than a long level look. A mentor who never once raised her voice in an argument and somehow still won every one of them. A friend who simply stopped responding to a group of people determined to provoke her, and watched, over time, as they quietly lost interest in trying. These people were rarely described by anyone who knew them as passive or weak. They were, almost without exception, described as formidable, a word that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the particular kind of stillness this entire conversation is about, and the 5 specific forms it takes. There are 5 specific silences that do this work, each suited to a different kind of moment, each one earning something that no argument, however well constructed, ever manages to earn in quite the same way. By the end of this, you will know exactly what each of these 5 silences is, why it works when words fail, and precisely how to begin practicing all 5, starting with the very next moment that calls for one. Before any of the 5, it's worth understanding why silence carries this particular kind of authority in the first place, because once the mechanism is clear, these 5 silences stop feeling like tricks and start feeling like simple, obvious sense. An argument, by its nature, invites a counter-argument. The moment you offer a defense, a rebuttal, a justification, you have implicitly agreed to play a game with rules the other person often gets to help write what counts as a good enough reason, what counts as fair. When the exchange is finally over, silence refuses the invitation entirely. It doesn't defend, so there's nothing to attack. It doesn't argue, so there's nothing to counter. And a provocation that has nowhere to land tends to do something almost nobody expects the first time they witness it. It collapses under its own weight, often more visibly and more completely than any response could have made it collapse. Consider the shape of an ordinary argument, stripped down to its bones. One person offers a claim, the other offers a counterclaim. The first person defends the original claim, adding detail. The second person finds a weakness in that detail and presses on it. This can continue almost indefinitely, because each new piece of information becomes new material for the other side to work with, and the argument rarely ends because one side has run out of things to say. It usually ends because one side has simply run out of energy to keep saying them. Silence interrupts this entire structure at its very first step, refusing to supply the counterclaim's raw material in the first place, and a structure with no raw material to build on simply has nowhere left to go. This is why arguments so rarely end with either side genuinely persuaded, and it's worth naming plainly, because it removes a great deal of the pressure people feel to win an argument through sheer verbal effort. Most disagreements are not actually settled by whoever makes the better case. They're settled by whoever tires first, or by whoever simply decides the exchange has stopped being worth continuing. Silence, chosen deliberately, is simply a faster, more dignified way of arriving at that same natural ending point. Without the hours of exhausting back and forth, most arguments demand before either side finally lets the subject go, exhausted rather than genuinely convinced of anything at all. This is not about becoming passive, avoidant, or unable to stand up for yourself, quite the opposite. Passive silence and commanding silence look almost identical from a distance, and feel entirely different from the inside, and the difference between them is really the entire subject of this conversation. Passive silence comes from fear, a swallowed reaction, a fight avoided because losing feels certain, a boundary that was never actually held, only postponed. Commanding silence comes from something closer to certainty. It is chosen, not defaulted into, and it carries a settled quality that fear-based silence never quite manages to fake, however hard it tries. The difference is often visible in the body itself, even before either kind of silence produces any outward effect. Passive silence tends to arrive with tension, a held breath, a tightened jaw, shoulders drawn up around the ears, the physical signature of something being suppressed rather than released. Commanding silence tends to arrive with the opposite, a loosened jaw, an easy, unhurried breath, a posture that stays open rather than braced. Learning to notice this physical difference in your own body, in the moment, is often the clearest way to tell which of the two silences you're actually in, long before either one has had the chance to produce a visible result. It's worth being honest, too, about what silence is not built for, because misapplying it does real damage to relationships that deserve better. Genuine misunderstandings between people who love each other are rarely resolved by silence. They need real conversation, real vulnerability, real words exchanged in good faith. Silence, in those moments, can curdle into something closer to punishment or avoidance, withholding connection from someone who actually deserves it. The 5 silences that follow are not about withdrawing from people who matter to you. They are about declining to hand your composure over to moments and people that were never going to be won through argument in the first place. Discernment is the skill underneath all 5, knowing which kind of moment you're actually in before deciding how to meet it. There is a psychological mechanism worth understanding plainly, because it explains why silence unsettles people who are used to being met with words, sometimes far more than an actual argument ever would. Most social conflict runs on an implicit script: provocation, response, counter-response, resolution or escalation, and both participants, whether they realize it or not, are relying on the other person's participation to keep that script moving forward. Silence removes one half of the script entirely. There is no return volley to react to, no defensive statement to pick apart, nothing to escalate against. The person left holding an unanswered provocation is often left, quite suddenly, alone with it, forced to sit with what they said without anyone else's reaction to distract from it or validate it, which is precisely the discomfort that tends to do the real work here. It's also worth naming honestly that women, in particular, are often taught the opposite lesson from a very young age, that a quiet woman is a passive one, that speaking up, defending herself loudly and immediately, is the only legitimate proof of strength available to her. This teaching is not wrong about the value of a genuine voice. It becomes limiting only when it forecloses the possibility that silence, chosen deliberately rather than defaulted into out of fear, can be its own form of strength, sometimes considerably more commanding than the loudest possible response would have been. Unlearning this particular lesson takes real, deliberate practice, precisely because so much of a life may have been spent believing the opposite. There's an important distinction to hold on to here, because women are also, separately, often trained toward a different kind of silence entirely, the silence of being talked over, dismissed, or simply never given room to speak in the first place. A silence imposed from the outside, rather than chosen deliberately from a place of settled confidence. This imposed silence is not what these 5 silences are describing, and it would be a serious misreading of this entire conversation to use it as justification for staying quiet in situations that genuinely call for a real, assertive voice. The 5 silences described here are always chosen, always available to be set aside the moment a genuine conversation calls for real words instead, and never a substitute for advocating for yourself in situations where speaking up is exactly what the moment requires, especially in a system that has already asked you to be quiet more often than was ever fair. The 5 silences that follow are precise tools, not a general instruction to stay quiet, and keeping that distinction clear from the outset matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. The first silence is the one that meets an insult, a jab, a comment made specifically to provoke a reaction. This is the silence most people have the hardest time holding, because the instinct to respond to an attack is almost animal in its immediacy, a flare of heat in the chest, a sentence half-formed before the other person has even finished speaking. And yet this exact moment is where silence does perhaps its most dramatic work of all 5, because a provocation is, structurally, a request. It is asking for something: anger, defensiveness, an argument to feed on, and the person who declines to supply that thing leaves the provocation with nowhere left to go. Watch what actually happens when an insult meets silence instead of a counterattack. The insult was designed to land somewhere, to produce a visible effect that confirms it hit its mark. When it lands instead on a face that doesn't flinch, a posture that doesn't tighten, a silence that simply holds steady and looks back without hostility, something in the exchange breaks down almost immediately. The room, if there is one, tends to feel it before anyone can articulate it, a strange, sudden awkwardness that settles not around the person who was insulted, but around the person who did the insulting, whose comment is now hanging in the air with nothing to attach itself to, and no one else willing to pick it up on their behalf. This particular silence has a specific quality worth naming precisely, because getting it wrong undermines the entire effect. It is not a cold, punishing silence, arms crossed, jaw tight, radiating fury without saying so out loud. That kind of silence is really just an unspoken argument, and it invites exactly the same escalation an actual argument would. The silence that actually earns respect here is closer to mild, genuine unbotheredness, the look of someone who heard the comment clearly, understood exactly what it was trying to do, and simply wasn't moved by it. A raised eyebrow, perhaps, an unhurried blink, sometimes even the faint suggestion of amusement, as though the comment revealed something more about the person who made it than about the person it was aimed at, which, more often than people realize, is exactly what an insult does. There is real truth underneath that last observation, worth sitting with, because it makes this first silence considerably easier to hold once it's genuinely understood. An insult is rarely, at its core, actually about the person receiving it. It's far more often a window into the insecurity, frustration, or discomfort of the person delivering it. A comment made specifically to provoke usually says more about what that person needs from the exchange than about anything true regarding the target of it. Holding this understanding in mind during the moment itself makes the silence considerably easier to access, because it reframes the entire situation from a personal attack requiring a personal defense into something closer to simply watching someone else's discomfort play out in real time, from a comfortable, unbothered distance. This silence is often hardest to hold with people who know exactly which buttons to press, the people who have studied your particular sensitivities for years and know precisely which comment will land hardest. Family members are frequently the most skilled at this, having had decades of practice, and it's precisely with family that this first silence tends to feel most impossible and matters most. A comment about your choices, your body, your career, delivered at a holiday table in front of relatives who are all quietly watching to see whether it landed. The old instinct is to defend, to explain, to prove the comment wrong with evidence. The silence that actually earns respect here does none of that. It simply lets the comment sit, unclaimed, in the space between the two of you, for exactly as long as it takes for the room to feel its own discomfort with what was just said, discomfort that, without a response to distract from it, tends to circle back toward the person who said it. In a romantic relationship, this first silence gets tested most often during an argument that has already turned unkind, where a partner reaches for something sharper than the actual disagreement calls for, hoping to provoke a matching reaction that will make the original point feel justified in hindsight. Meeting that sharper comment with silence rather than an equally sharp reply denies the argument the escalation it was reaching for, and very often the partner who threw the jab hears the silence that follows more loudly than any retort could have landed, because there is nothing there to distract from what was just said. With strangers, this silence matters in a different, lower stakes way. Though the mechanism stays identical, a rude comment from someone at a checkout counter, an unsolicited insult online from someone who will never matter to your actual life. These are, in some ways, the easiest places to practice this first silence, precisely because so little is genuinely at stake in trying it, and the muscle built here in low-stakes moments transfers cleanly into the higher-stakes ones that matter more. The second silence is the one that replaces self-defense, the refusal to argue your case to someone who has already quietly decided not to believe you, no matter what you say. This is a different silence from the first, aimed not at a single insult, but at an entire pattern of being misread, misunderstood, or deliberately mischaracterized by someone who benefits, in some way, from continuing to see you that way. The instinct here is often even stronger than with a single provocation, because the stakes feel higher being misunderstood by someone whose opinion matters, having your character mischaracterized to people who might believe it, watching a version of yourself get constructed by someone else's narrative that bears little resemblance to who you actually are. Here is what almost nobody realizes about this particular situation until they've lived through it several times. A person determined not to understand you is rarely persuaded out of that determination by more evidence, more explanation, more patient, careful clarification. If anything, continuing to argue your case to someone like this often confirms, in their own mind, the very narrative you're trying to correct, proof to them that you're defensive, that you're hiding something, that the accusation must have some truth to it or you wouldn't be working so hard to deny it. The more you explain, the more material you hand over for the mischaracterization to feed on. This is genuinely one of the hardest silences to hold, because the fear underneath it is rarely irrational being misunderstood by someone whose opinion actually carries weight in your life, can have real consequences, and the anxious voice insisting that you must correct the record immediately is not simply being dramatic. What this second silence asks is not that you ignore this fear entirely, but that you separate it honestly from the compulsive urge to keep explaining, regardless of whether explaining has ever actually worked with this particular person. If repeated explanation across months or years has never once shifted their view, continuing to offer more of the same explanation is not diligence. It's simply repetition of something already proven not to work, however uncomfortable it feels to finally accept that fact. The silence that replaces this kind of exhausting self-defense is not a silence of surrender. It's a silence built on a specific quiet realization that your actual character does not require this particular person's accurate understanding of it in order to remain true. Your life, your relationships, your reputation among the people who actually know you well do not collapse simply because one person has decided to see you inaccurately and refuses to update that picture no matter what you say. Letting that person's misunderstanding simply exist, uncorrected, without spending further energy trying to fix it, is one of the clearest demonstrations of self-possession there is, because it requires trusting your own sense of yourself enough to no longer need this particular person's agreement with it. It's worth being precise about where this silence stops applying, because there are moments where continuing to correct the record genuinely matters and shouldn't be abandoned in the name of composure. A false accusation with real professional or legal consequences, a mischaracterization being used to justify formal disciplinary action, a pattern being reported to someone with actual authority to act on it. These situations call for clear, documented correction through the appropriate channel, not silence. This second silence is specifically for the ongoing, informal battle to win one particular person's private opinion of you, a battle that rarely has a winnable endpoint and rarely justifies the energy required to keep fighting it, once it's clear the other person was never going to update their view regardless of what you said, however many times or however carefully you said it. There's a useful test for telling the two situations apart when the difference isn't immediately obvious. Ask whether you've already attempted the correction clearly and reasonably more than once, and whether it produced any actual change in how the other person treats or describes you. If the answer is no, repeated attempts have already provided the evidence needed. Continuing to try the same approach a third, fourth, or fifth time, hoping for a different result, is rarely diligence. It's simply the old instinct to keep explaining, dressed up as persistence, and it rarely serves anyone better than the silence would have. This silence is tested most severely in workplaces, where a colleague or a manager has built a narrative about your competence, your attitude, or your reliability that doesn't match reality. And every instinct screams that the narrative needs correcting immediately, before it spreads, before it costs you something real. Sometimes correction genuinely is necessary, a factual error that affects a decision, a false claim that needs formal addressing through the right channels. But a huge amount of workplace mischaracterization is not actually about facts at all. It's about a fixed impression that facts alone rarely dislodge, and continuing to argue against it, meeting after meeting, often reads to everyone watching as exactly the anxious, defensive behavior the narrative claims you have. Letting your actual, consistent work speak for itself over time without constantly relitigating a single person's fixed opinion tends to do more to shift a reputation than any individual defense ever could. This silence is tested just as severely, though far more painfully, in the aftermath of a relationship that has ended badly, where an ex-partner has constructed a version of events and a version of you that circulates among mutual friends and family in a way that feels, at times, genuinely unbearable to leave uncorrected. The instinct to set the record straight with every mutual friend, every family member who might have heard the distorted account, can consume enormous amounts of energy for a result that rarely arrives. People who were determined to believe one version of events before hearing yours are rarely moved by hearing yours, and people who know you well enough to question the distorted version usually do so on their own, without needing you to campaign for it. Letting the mischaracterization exist, uncorrected, among people whose good opinion was never actually going to be swayed by your defense, frees up an enormous amount of energy for the people and the life still genuinely in front of you. The third silence is the one that closes a conversation, leaving a disagreement, a room, or a relationship without needing to deliver the last word on your way out. This might be the silence most commonly mistaken for losing, because so much of how people are taught to think about conflict treats the final statement as the actual prize, the thing that determines who won and who didn't. The person who has built this third silence understands something different. That some conversations were never contests to begin with, and staying inside one simply to claim the last sentence often costs far more than it could ever be worth. It's worth naming the exception clearly, because not every unfinished conversation should be left that way. Genuine practical matters, splitting shared finances, coordinating custody arrangements, decisions that actually require both people's agreement to move forward need real resolution, not a graceful exit dressed up as composure. This third silence applies specifically to conversations that have degraded into repetition without any new ground being covered, where continuing serves nobody's actual interests except the temporary satisfaction of having spoken last. Distinguishing between a conversation still capable of producing something useful and one that has simply become a loop is again the discernment this entire practice depends on. There is a particular trap here, worth naming, specifically, because it catches nearly everyone at some point in their life. The belief that leaving before an argument has fully resolved itself, before the other person has conceded anything, means the other person has won by default. This belief keeps people locked in exhausting, circular exchanges long after any actual exchange of ideas has stopped happening, long after both sides are simply repeating themselves louder, in the hope that volume alone will eventually produce agreement. Recognizing the exact moment a conversation has crossed from disagreement into a drain, and choosing, calmly, to leave it there rather than chase a resolution that was never actually available, is precisely what this third silence is built to do. This silence looks different depending on where it's practiced. In an argument with a partner that has become circular and unproductive, it might look like saying, simply, "I don't think we're getting anywhere right now, and I'd like to come back to this later," and then actually leaving the room, without a final point squeezed in on the way out the door. In a family dispute that has degraded into old grievances being replayed for the 10th time, it might look like standing up from the table, calmly, mid-conversation, without delivering a closing argument that settles nothing except who gets to feel briefly satisfied. In a professional disagreement with someone who has no intention of actually hearing an alternative view, it might look like simply saying, "I understand your position," and ending the meeting there, without spending another 20 minutes trying to win an argument that was never going to be won in that room, on that day, with that particular audience, no matter how well it was argued. What makes this silence so effective is precisely what makes it so uncomfortable to practice. It requires releasing the outcome entirely, trusting that your worth in the disagreement was never actually dependent on delivering a satisfying final sentence. Most people who master this silence describe the same strange discovery once they finally try it, that the anticipated loss, the sense that walking away without the last word would leave them somehow diminished, almost never actually materializes. What replaces it more often than not is a kind of clean, settled feeling that outlasts anything a perfectly delivered closing argument ever produced. This silence also applies, perhaps even more urgently, to text messages and online arguments, where the option to keep responding is always technically available, and the temptation to send just one more message, correcting one more point, is almost endless. A disagreement conducted over text can theoretically continue for hours, each reply escalating slightly past the one before it, simply because nothing about the format naturally imposes an ending, the way a conversation happening in person eventually does. Practicing this third silence here means consciously choosing to stop replying before the exchange has fully resolved itself, closing the phone, and trusting that an unanswered message does not require an explanation for why it went unanswered, tomorrow or ever. The fourth silence is quieter still, and it happens long before any conflict has even begun. The silence around plans and intentions that haven't yet become real. This is the practice of not announcing a decision, a goal, or a hope out loud before it has actually taken shape, resisting the very common urge to talk about what you're planning to do long before you've actually done any of it. This silence rarely gets discussed alongside the others because it isn't aimed at another person's provocation or misunderstanding. It's aimed instead at a much subtler and more common drain. The way early unformed plans lose their momentum the moment they're exposed too soon to other people's opinions, doubts, or well-meaning discouragement. There is a specific psychological cost to announcing an intention before it's ready that almost nobody accounts for. Talking about a plan, in detail, to an interested audience produces a small hit of social recognition and satisfaction that feels, to the brain, remarkably similar to the satisfaction of having actually accomplished something. This can quietly sap the motivation that was supposed to carry the plan forward into actual execution, because a piece of the reward has already been collected in advance, for free, simply by talking about it. Beyond that, every person who hears an early plan brings their own doubts, their own experience of failure, their own well-intentioned but deflating questions. Are you sure? Have you thought about what if? Each one landing on a plan that was often too fragile, too newly formed, to withstand that kind of scrutiny. Yet the woman who has built this fourth silence has learned to hold new plans privately for a while, sometimes telling almost no one, until the plan has enough of its own internal structure to survive contact with other people's opinions. A career change gets researched and prepared quietly before it's announced to family members who will inevitably have concerns. A creative project gets built in private, past the fragile early stage, before it's shown to anyone whose casual doubt could talk her out of something she genuinely wanted. This silence is not secrecy born of shame. It's protection, extended to something not yet strong enough to withstand an audience, the same way a seedling gets shielded from wind until its roots have had time to take hold. This is not a blanket argument for total secrecy, and it's worth being precise about the distinction. A small, carefully chosen circle, one trusted partner, one close friend, whose support has proven unconditional over years, can often hold an early plan safely, offering genuine encouragement rather than the deflating scrutiny a wider audience tends to bring. The skill here is not silence toward everyone equally. It's discernment about which few people have actually earned early access to something still fragile, and holding the rest of the audience at a comfortable distance until the plan is ready for wider exposure, strong enough by then to withstand whatever opinions finally arrive. This particular silence often surprises people with how much it changes their relationship to their own follow-through. Freed from the social reward of having already talked about the plan, and freed from the discouraging weight of other people's early doubts, plans held privately for a while tend to actually get finished at a noticeably higher rate than plans announced the moment they're conceived. The silence, in other words, isn't just protective. It's structurally useful, doing quiet work that talking about the plan would have actively undermined, work that becomes visible only once the plan has finally become real enough to speak for itself. This silence extends naturally into deeply personal decisions as well, the choice to leave a relationship, to move to a new city, to make a significant change in how a life is being lived. These decisions, more than almost any other kind, attract instant opinions from nearly everyone who hears about them, most of it offered with genuine good intentions, and almost none of it actually helpful during the fragile, early stage when the decision is still being tested privately against reality. Holding this kind of decision quietly, discussing it only with the one or two people whose judgment is genuinely trusted and whose support is unconditional, protects the decision through exactly the period it's most vulnerable to being talked out of by well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful outside opinion, before it's had the chance to become fully, unshakably yours. The fifth silence is the one that lets someone else's behavior speak for itself without narrating it, explaining it, or pointing it out to the people around you. This is the practice of not constantly interpreting a difficult person's actions out loud for everyone else's benefit. Not saying, "Did you see what she just did?" or "Can you believe he said that?" The moment something unkind or inappropriate happens in front of a group. The instinct to narrate is often born from a genuine, understandable desire to be validated, to have someone else confirm that what just happened really was as strange, as rude, or as out of line as it felt. But narrating it constantly, every single time, often has the paradoxical effect of making the narrator look more reactive than the original behavior deserved, while the person actually behaving badly quietly escapes the same scrutiny because attention has shifted toward the person pointing it out instead. The woman who has built this fifth silence has learned that most bad behavior, left alone without commentary, eventually becomes visible on its own, to the people who are paying real attention, without needing a narrator to flag it first. A colleague who repeatedly interrupts, undermines, or takes credit for others' work will, given enough time and enough repetition, become obvious to anyone genuinely watching, without a single word needing to be said about it by anyone else. A family member whose careless comments have become a running pattern will eventually be seen clearly by the rest of the family, on their own timeline, through their own direct observation, in a way that tends to land far more permanently than if someone else had spent years pointing it out on their behalf. This silence requires a particular kind of patience that runs against nearly every modern instinct, which favors immediate commentary, instant validation, the quick relief of saying something out loud the moment it happens. Holding this fifth silence means trusting that the truth of a pattern will surface eventually on its own timeline, without needing to be forced into visibility through constant narration. It also, quietly, protects the person holding it from being cast as the complainer, the one who's always pointing fingers, a reputation that can attach itself to someone who narrates too often, regardless of how accurate every individual observation actually was. There is a particular kind of persuasion that only works this way, and it's worth understanding why, because it explains why this fifth silence is so much more effective than it might initially seem. A conclusion someone reaches through their own direct observation carries far more weight and proves far more durable than the identical conclusion handed to them by someone else's narration. Being told repeatedly that a person is unkind tends to produce, at best, cautious agreement. Watching that unkindness unfold firsthand, without commentary steering the interpretation, tends to produce genuine, settled conviction, the kind that doesn't waver the next time the unkind person happens to be on their best behavior. This fifth silence isn't simply about avoiding a reputation for complaining. It's about allowing the most persuasive version of the truth to do its own work, uninterrupted, on a timeline that was never yours to control in the first place. There's real skill in knowing when this fifth silence applies and when it doesn't, because there are situations of genuine harm, patterns that need to be formally reported, behavior that's actively endangering someone, where staying silent would be a failure of responsibility rather than an act of composure. This fifth silence is specifically about the smaller, more ordinary moments of rudeness, carelessness, and casual bad behavior that don't rise to that level. Moments where the instinct to narrate is really just a search for validation, rather than a genuine need to protect someone from harm. Learning to tell the two apart is Again, the discernment underneath all 5 of these silences, and it's worth taking seriously rather than treating as a minor footnote. Among friend groups, this 5th silence shows up most clearly around the person whose casual unkindness has become a running joke everyone quietly notices, but nobody has ever addressed directly. The instinct to point out each new instance to the group, building a shared, ongoing commentary, can feel bonding in the moment, but it also, subtly, keeps the group's attention centered on the behavior, rather than allowing individual friends to draw their own conclusions at their own pace. Letting each person notice the pattern independently, without a constant chorus pointing it out, tends to produce a more lasting shift in how the group treats that person than any amount of shared commentary ever manages to achieve, precisely because each conclusion arrives fully owned, rather than borrowed. Here is what actually changes, concretely, once these 5 silences become a genuine, practiced part of how a person moves through conflict, because the shift shows up in specific, observable ways rather than remaining an abstract idea. It's worth noting, before listing these changes, that they rarely arrive quickly, and expecting an immediate transformation after only a few attempts tends to produce disappointment that discourages the practice before it's had a real chance to work. Most people who build these 5 silences successfully describe a gradual, almost imperceptible shift over several months, rather than a single dramatic before and after moment. Patience with that timeline matters as much as the practice itself, since impatience with your own progress here can undo more of the work than any single missed opportunity ever could. People stop testing as often. Someone who has learned, through direct, repeated experience, that a provocation lands on unshaken ground, that a mischaracterization doesn't produce the satisfying argument they were hoping for, that the last word can't actually be claimed from you because you've simply stopped competing for it, gradually stops attempting all 3, because none of them produce the result they used to reliably produce. This rarely happens after a single instance. It happens after enough repetition that the old pattern of provoking, correcting, or arguing simply stops seeming worth the effort. Your words, when you do choose to speak, start carrying more weight. There's a particular effect where someone who is known to hold silence well is taken far more seriously the rare times they actually do speak up, precisely because their words are no longer background noise in a constant stream of defense and commentary. A correction offered by someone who rarely corrects anything lands with considerably more force than the same correction offered by someone who corrects everything constantly as a matter of habit. And perhaps most significantly, the relationship to conflict itself changes internally. Disagreements that used to feel like emergencies requiring an immediate, thorough response start to feel, gradually, like ordinary weather passing through noticed, assessed, and often left alone to pass on its own, rather than treated as a crisis demanding your full engagement every single time. This shift, more than any single external result, is often what people describe as the most valuable outcome of building these 5 silences at all. There's a 5th change worth naming, one that tends to arrive last and often surprises people the most. Others in your life gradually begin adopting a calmer register around you, almost by proximity, the way a room's volume tends to settle around one person who never raises their own voice. Family members who once escalated quickly during disagreements find themselves, over time, escalating less in your presence specifically, matching, without quite meaning to, the steadier baseline you've established. This is rarely the explicit goal of building these 5 silences, but it tends to follow naturally once they're genuinely, consistently practiced rather than performed only occasionally, becoming, eventually, simply the atmosphere you carry with you into every room you enter. Building these 5 silences into actual, lived behavior takes real, repeated practice, because the instinct running against every one of them to defend, to explain, to have the last word, to announce plans early, to narrate other people's bad behavior is old, automatic, and reinforced by years of genuine social conditioning that made these instincts feel necessary at the time. Real change here happens gradually, in small, repeated moments, rather than through a single decision made once and never revisited. It helps to choose one of the 5 to focus on first, rather than attempting to overhaul how you handle every kind of conflict simultaneously. Notice which of the 5 produced the strongest reaction while reading about it, the one that felt hardest to imagine actually holding. That reaction is usually a reliable signal of exactly where the old pattern runs deepest, and exactly where deliberate practice will do the most good first. Depth in one silence, built patiently over a few weeks, tends to make the other 4 considerably easier to access once the first has genuinely taken hold. It also helps, across all 5, to rehearse the physical component of the silence itself in private before it's ever needed in a real moment. An unhurried breath, a relaxed jaw, shoulders that stay open rather than tensing defensively, these can be practiced alone, in a quiet room, until they become accessible without conscious thought. The body that has already rehearsed staying settled under imagined pressure finds it considerably easier to stay settled under real pressure. The same way any physical skill improves with repetition long before it's actually tested in the moment that matters, when there's no time left to think it through carefully first. Begin with the first silence, because provocations happen often enough in ordinary life to offer frequent, low-stakes practice. The next time a mildly provoking comment lands nothing especially serious, just a small jab or an unnecessary remark practice, simply not filling the silence that follows with a defense or a comeback. Notice how uncomfortable the pause feels the first several times, and notice, too, how quickly that discomfort passes once the moment has actually been survived a few times in a row. It can help, in the moment itself, to take a single slow breath before responding at all, using that breath as a physical anchor that gives the old automatic reply just enough time to lose its momentum before it escapes. Move next into practicing the 3rd silence in low-stakes disagreements, the kind that genuinely don't matter enough to justify winning. Practice leaving a minor disagreement with a stranger online, with a family member over something inconsequential before it's fully resolved, deliberately declining to deliver the closing argument that feels, in the moment, so tempting to deliver. This builds the muscle needed to later apply the same silence somewhere the stakes are considerably higher. A simple, internal reminder can help here, asking yourself, in the middle of the pull to keep arguing, whether this particular exchange is actually worth what continuing it will cost, more often than not landing on an honest no. For the 2nd silence, choose one specific relationship where you've noticed yourself repeatedly explaining, defending, or correcting a mischaracterization that never seems to actually change, no matter how many times you address it. Practice, for a set period a month, perhaps simply not engaging with that particular mischaracterization anymore, redirecting the conversation elsewhere instead, and pay close attention to what actually happens as a result. Most people discover that the world does not collapse when a single stubborn misunderstanding is finally left alone. Keeping a brief, private note of what you observe during this month, whether the relationship changes, whether other people's opinions of you shift, regardless, builds a body of real evidence to draw on the next time the old instinct to defend yourself rises up again. For the fourth silence, choose one new plan or intention currently forming, and deliberately hold it privately for longer than instinct wants to. Notice the urge to tell someone, to share the exciting new idea, and sit with that urge without acting on it immediately. Let the plan develop further in private before exposing it to any outside opinion at all, and notice whether this changes how the plan actually feels to you, how much more solid it seems once it's finally shared. If the urge to tell someone becomes difficult to sit with, try writing the plan down instead, in as much detail as you'd normally share out loud. This often satisfies the underlying urge to give the idea shape and form, without exposing it to anyone else's premature opinion. For the fifth silence, practice simply observing a difficult person's behavior without narrating it to anyone else for 1 full week, even when the urge to point it out feels strong. Trust that the behavior will remain visible on its own, to anyone genuinely paying attention, without your help. Notice, at the end of the week, whether the pattern felt any less real for having gone unnarrated, or whether it simply continued speaking for itself exactly as it always had. If the urge to discuss it becomes genuinely difficult to hold, a private journal entry, written only for yourself, can offer the same relief that narrating it to someone else would have, without recruiting anyone else into the ongoing commentary. Extend the same week to 2 and then a month, if the first week goes well, letting the practice deepen gradually rather than treating a single successful week as the finish line. Expect discomfort throughout all 5 of these practices, particularly in the beginning, because each one asks you to override an old, automatic instinct that has, in one way or another, felt protective for a very long time. This discomfort is not evidence that the practice is wrong. It's simply the friction of interrupting a deeply ingrained pattern, and like most friction of this kind, it fades considerably faster than it seems like it possibly could from inside the anxious moment itself. Expect, too, that you will slip, more than once, reverting to the old instinct at exactly the moment you'd meant to hold one of these 5 silences instead. There will be a comeback delivered before you can stop it, a plan announced too early out of sheer excitement, a last word claimed despite every intention otherwise. This is not evidence that any of this was wrong for you, or that you're somehow unsuited to holding silence well. It's simply what practicing a genuinely new pattern actually looks like. And the only real misstep available here is treating a single slip as proof the whole effort was pointless, rather than simply returning to the practice the very next time one of these 5 moments arrives. There is real cost to never building any of these 5 silences, and the cost, as with so much of what shapes a life, rarely announces itself all at once. It accumulates instead across years spent defending against provocations that were never worth the energy, years spent arguing against a fixed misunderstanding that never actually moved, years spent needing the last word in conversations that cost more than any victory in them was ever worth, years spent watching half-formed plans lose momentum the moment they were exposed too early to other people's doubts. Years spent narrating other people's bad behavior so constantly that the narrating itself became the story, rather than the behavior it was meant to expose. There's a specific physical dimension to this cost that deserves naming directly, because it's rarely discussed alongside the more relational consequences. Every unheld silence, every provocation answered, every fixed misunderstanding re-argued, every last word delivered, every plan announced too early, every behavior narrated aloud carries a small physiological cost: elevated heart rate, tightened muscles, the low hum of adrenaline that comes with any perceived confrontation, however minor. Repeated dozens of times a week, across years, this cost compounds into something that looks, from a distance, remarkably like chronic tension, even though its true source, a lifetime of unnecessary verbal engagement, rarely gets identified correctly by the person carrying it. There's also a specific relational cost worth naming, because it shapes something beyond any single conflict. A reputation, built over years, as someone who can always be pulled into an argument, someone whose reaction is reliably available to anyone who wants to provoke one. This reputation, once established, tends to attract exactly the kind of provocation it was never meant to invite, because people who enjoy provoking a reaction are drawn, almost instinctively, toward the person most likely to supply one. Building these 5 silences doesn't just change how you respond to provocation. Over time, it changes how much provocation actually arrives in the first place, because the reputation for reliably reacting is precisely what tends to disappear first, leaving considerably less for anyone to bother provoking at all. There was a woman who spent most of her professional life known as someone who didn't let things go, a reputation she'd built, entirely unintentionally, through years of responding to every slight, every mischaracterization, every unproductive argument with the same instinct to correct, to defend, to make sure the record was accurate before she'd allow the conversation to end. Colleagues respected her thoroughness, but had, over time, also grown slightly wary of engaging with her on anything remotely contentious, sensing that any disagreement would likely turn into a longer exchange than they had the energy for. The shift began with a single meeting where a colleague misrepresented her contribution to a project in front of several people whose opinions genuinely mattered to her career. Every instinct told her to correct it immediately, in detail, in front of the same audience. Instead, exhausted enough that day to simply lack the energy for the usual thorough defense, she said only, "That's not quite how I remember it," and let the meeting move on without pressing further. She spent the rest of that day convinced she'd made a mistake, that letting the misrepresentation stand uncorrected would cost her credibility she couldn't afford to lose. What actually happened surprised her. 2 colleagues who'd witnessed the exchange approached her separately over the following days, mentioning, unprompted, that they'd noticed the mischaracterization themselves and had found it unfair validation she never would have received if she'd spent the meeting itself locked in a lengthy correction that might have looked, to onlookers, like simple defensiveness. She began applying the same restraint elsewhere, letting more provocations and mischaracterizations pass without her usual thorough response, and discovered, gradually, that her reputation shifted in a direction she hadn't anticipated, from someone who argued everything to someone whose occasional silence, when it did arrive, seemed to carry more weight precisely because it was no longer constant. A year into the practice, she was offered a leadership role that had previously gone to a colleague with a considerably louder, more argumentative presence in meetings, a decision her manager, in the conversation offering her the position, attributed directly to what he described as her steadiness under pressure, a quality she recognized, with some quiet satisfaction, as nothing more mysterious than the accumulated result of holding this second silence, meeting after meeting, for an entire year, one uncorrected mischaracterization at a time. There was another version of this lesson, learned by a man in the middle of a contentious divorce, who had spent months narrating every frustrating thing his soon-to-be ex-spouse did to whichever friend or family member happened to be listening, seeking, each time, a small hit of validation that briefly relieved the frustration before it built right back up again. The narrating had become so constant that a close friend, gently, finally told him that the constant commentary was starting to make him seem more consumed by the conflict than the actual situation. In her honest opinion, seemed to warrant. The comment stung, but it landed. He began, deliberately holding his observations privately, instead of narrating each one immediately to whoever was nearby, journaling them instead if he genuinely needed somewhere to put the frustration, saving the conversations for a therapist, rather than for every friend who happened to ask how things were going. Within a few months, he noticed something he hadn't expected. The frustration itself seemed to lose some of its grip on him once it stopped being constantly reinforced through retelling. And separately, without him ever pointing anything out again, several mutual friends began, on their own, noticing and commenting on his ex-spouse's behavior directly to him, unprompted. The exact validation he'd been chasing through constant narration, now arriving on its own, entirely unforced, once he'd finally stopped chasing it. A third story belongs to a woman who had spent years believing that walking away from an argument without the last word meant she had lost it, a belief formed early in a household where the loudest, most persistent voice always seemed to determine who was right. This belief followed her into her marriage, where disagreements with her husband routinely stretched on for hours, each of them circling the same points repeatedly, both refusing to concede the floor first, both convinced that whoever spoke last would somehow win something meaningful in the exchange. The turning point arrived during an argument that had already covered the same ground 3 separate times in a single evening, both of them exhausted, neither one actually listening anymore. For reasons she couldn't fully explain afterward, she simply stopped mid-sentence, said, "I don't think either of us is going to say anything new tonight," and went to bed, leaving the argument genuinely unfinished for the first time in the marriage. She lay awake for a long while, certain she'd conceded something important by leaving first. In the morning, her husband, rested and considerably calmer, brought up the disagreement again on his own, and they resolved in 15 minutes what 3 hours of the previous night's circling had failed to touch. She began applying the same practice to nearly every future disagreement that showed the same repetitive shape, and over several years, both she and her husband found that their arguments simply became shorter, resolved faster, once neither of them was fighting quite so hard to have the final word, a shift she later described as having saved the marriage far more hours of genuine peace than either of them could have easily counted. A fourth story, smaller in scale, belongs to a young writer who had spent years telling everyone who would listen about the novel she intended to write, describing the plot, the characters, the themes, in enthusiastic detail at every dinner party and family gathering for nearly 3 years, and never actually writing more than a few scattered pages of it. A friend, with real kindness rather than judgment, eventually pointed out, gently, that she seemed to enjoy talking about the book more than working on it, an observation that stung precisely because it was accurate. She decided, almost as an experiment, to stop mentioning the project entirely for 6 months, telling no one, not even her closest friends, what she was working on during that stretch. The change in her own relationship to the project was immediate, and, to her, genuinely surprising without the small satisfaction of describing the book to an interested audience. The only remaining source of satisfaction was the actual writing itself, and for the first time in years, she found herself returning to the manuscript daily rather than talking about returning to it. By the end of those 6 months, she had a complete draft, something 3 years of enthusiastic conversation had never managed to produce. A fifth and final story belongs to a teenage girl, watching her mother model the first silence for the first time without either of them ever naming what was happening. An extended family member at a crowded holiday dinner made a cutting remark about the mother's decision to return to school later in life, delivered with a smile that made it difficult to call out directly without seeming humorless. The daughter, 16 at the time, braced for her mother's usual response, a quick, sharp defense that had, in the past, often escalated these moments into longer, more uncomfortable exchanges that ruined the rest of the gathering. Instead, her mother simply looked at the relative for a long moment, said nothing at all, and calmly resumed eating, leaving the comment to hang, entirely unclaimed, in a silence that grew more uncomfortable. With every passing second, nobody filled it. The relative, visibly unsettled by the lack of response, awkwardly changed the subject within moments. The daughter, watching this unfold, later described it as the first time she'd ever seen her mother win an exchange without saying a single word, and she began, over the following years, quietly practicing the same restraint in her own life with classmates, later with co-workers, carrying forward a lesson her mother had never once explained out loud, taught entirely through a single held silence at a crowded dinner table. There is one more thing worth saying clearly before this closes, because without it, these 5 silences risk being misread as a form of coldness or withdrawal from the people who actually deserve your full, honest voice. None of this is about becoming quiet with everyone, about withholding your real thoughts, your real vulnerability, your real self from people who have earned genuine closeness with you. These 5 silences are precise tools, meant for precise moments. The provocation that wants a reaction, the fixed misunderstanding that words can't move, the argument that's become a drain, the plan too fragile for early scrutiny, the bad behavior that doesn't need your narration to eventually become visible. Everywhere else, your voice, your honesty, your full engagement remain exactly as valuable and exactly as necessary as they've always been. There is a simple test worth keeping in mind whenever you're deciding which kind of moment you're actually in. Ask whether speaking would genuinely serve understanding, connection, or resolution between 2 people who both want the relationship to work, or whether speaking would only feed a dynamic that was never actually built on either party wanting real resolution in the first place. The first kind of moment deserves your full, honest voice, however difficult the conversation might be. The second kind of moment is exactly where one of these 5 silences belongs, not as an escape from difficulty, but as a refusal to keep feeding something that words were never actually going to fix. What tends to settle underneath all of this, once these 5 silences have had enough time to genuinely take root, is something quieter than victory and steadier than pride. It's simply composure, the specific, hard-won capacity to meet provocation, misunderstanding, unproductive conflict, premature exposure, and other people's bad behavior, without needing to spend a single unnecessary word defending, correcting, winning, announcing, or narrating any of it. That composure was never something anyone else could hand over. It was always something to be built, one held silence at a time, starting with whatever moment happens to arrive next, however small or ordinary it turns out to be. There is no finish line to this practice, no point at which all 5 silences become permanently automatic and never again require conscious effort. Some days, the right silence will arrive easily, almost without thought. Other days, particularly under real pressure or with the people who know exactly how to provoke a reaction, the old instinct to speak will rise up just as strongly as it ever did, and choosing silence instead will require real, deliberate effort all over again. Neither version of that experience means the practice has failed. It simply means it's still alive, still being built, one held silence at a time. This practice, like the quieter forms of composure it's built from, rarely stays contained to the person who builds it. Children watch a parent hold a provocation without flinching and absorb, without ever being taught it directly, that composure is possible even under real pressure. Friends spending time around someone who holds these 5 silences consistently often find their own reactive instincts, softening simply through proximity. The same way one calm presence in a room can gradually lower the temperature of an entire conversation without a single word being spoken about it. None of this needs to be the explicit goal for it to happen. It's simply what tends to follow when one person stops feeding every provocation, every misunderstanding, every argument, every early plan, and every piece of gossip with words it never actually needed. Today, the next time one of these 5 moments arrives, a jab that wants a comeback, a misunderstanding that wants correcting, an argument that's stopped being productive, a plan that wants announcing before it's ready, or someone's bad behavior that wants narrating, practice choosing the silence instead, just once, and notice what actually happens as a result. None of this requires a dramatic transformation or a single perfect moment to prove that something has changed. It only requires the next ordinary instance where speaking felt automatic, and the small deliberate choice to hold the silence instead, and see, for yourself, exactly what it earns you, that words never quite manage to.